Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate, Carl Jung. We walk through life wearing masks, carefully constructed personas that present to the world who we believe ourselves to be, or perhaps who we wish to be. Beneath this polished surface, however, something stirs in the darkness, something we refuse to acknowledge, something we have spent our entire lives rejecting. Carl Jung called this the shadow, and it represents everything about ourselves that we cannot or will not accept. The shadow is not simply the opposite of who we are. It is far more complex and far more integral to our being than that. While we consciously identify with what we consider good, rational, and acceptable, the shadow contains all that we deem unworthy. Our anger lives there, our envy, our cruelty, our inappropriate desires, all the qualities that society taught us to hide, all the impulses we learned to suppress. These do not disappear simply because we refuse to acknowledge them. They retreat into the unconscious, where they continue to influence our lives in ways we neither recognize nor understand. Jung discovered through his clinical work that the more forcefully we deny these aspects of ourselves, the more powerfully they manifest. The man who prides himself on gentleness may find himself inexplicably enraged at trivial provocations. The woman who considers herself utterly selfless may harbor deep resentments that poison every relationship she touches. The person who believes themselves incapable of dishonesty may find themselves trapped in webs of self-deception so elaborate that truth and lie become indistinguishable. This is the great paradox of the shadow. What we resist most vehemently within ourselves appears most forcefully in our outer world. We project these disowned parts onto others, seeing in them the very qualities we cannot bear to acknowledge in ourselves. That neighbor who irritates you beyond all reasonable measure? That colleague whose very presence fills you with inexplicable dread? That public figure you loathe with an intensity that surprises even you? More often than not, they are mirrors, reflecting back the face you refuse to see. Jung observed that every psychological problem is fundamentally a spiritual one, and nowhere is this more apparent than in our relationship with the shadow. The fragmentation we experience within ourselves creates a wound that cannot heal through external means alone. We may achieve success, accumulate wealth, and surround ourselves with admirers, yet still feel an inexplicable emptiness. Something essential is missing, and no amount of outer accomplishment can fill the void created by inner division. The process of shadow integration begins with honest recognition, which is simple in theory but profoundly difficult in practice. We must learn to see ourselves clearly, without the comfortable illusions that protect our self-image. This requires what Jung called imagination for evil, the capacity to acknowledge that we, too, contain within ourselves the potential for cruelty, selfishness, and destruction that we so readily condemn in others. Consider the mechanisms by which we avoid this recognition. We rationalize our failures. We justify our petty cruelties. We construct elaborate narratives that cast ourselves always as the innocent victim rather than the perpetrator. When confronted with our own shortcomings, we become defensive, hostile, or retreat into wounded silence. These are the shadow's protective maneuvers, desperate attempts to maintain the illusion of our own goodness, but consciousness demands sacrifice. To know ourselves truly, we must be willing to see ourselves as we actually are, not as we wish to be, not as others expect us to be, but in the raw, unvarnished truth of our complete being. Jung wrote that the encounter with the shadow is unavoidable and painful. It provokes an open conflict within the psyche that cannot be resolved through simple effort of will. The shadow reveals itself in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in moments when our carefully constructed persona suddenly cracks and something else emerges. In dreams, the shadow often appears as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer, a threatening stranger, a criminal, a beggar, or someone we instinctively recoil from. Yet, this figure is not truly other. It is ourselves, calling out for recognition and integration. One of Jung's most profound insights was that the shadow contains not only negative qualities, but also positive ones we have repressed. Many people deny their own strength, their creativity, and their capacity for joy. Perhaps they grew up in environments where these qualities were dangerous to express, where showing confidence invited punishment, and where genuine happiness provoked jealousy. So these gifts, too, became part of the shadow, hidden away in the unconscious, unavailable to consciousness. This is why Jung insisted that the shadow gives us substance and mass. Without it, we are merely two-dimensional cutouts, performing virtue rather than embodying wholeness. The work of integration cannot be accomplished through willpower alone. We cannot simply decide to embrace our shadow and be done with it. The process requires patience, humility, and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths. We must learn to observe ourselves without judgment, to notice when we are projecting our own qualities onto others, and to recognize the patterns of behavior that keep us trapped in unconsciousness. Active imagination serves as one method for this work. Unlike passive fantasy, where we drift aimlessly through imagined scenarios, active imagination requires conscious participation. We allow images to arise from the unconscious, but we engage with them, question them, and enter into dialogue with the figures that appear. The ancient myths understood this necessity long before psychology gave it a name. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories, we encounter the proud king Gilgamesh, who tyrannizes his people with his unchecked power and arrogance. The gods, seeing the imbalance, create Enkidu, a wild man, a mirror image of Gilgamesh, embodying everything the civilized king has rejected. Enkidu lives with animals, knows nothing of human society, and represents pure instinct and untamed nature. When these two meet, they fight with tremendous violence, each recognizing in the other something they both fear and need. Their battle is not merely physical, but psychological, the conscious ego wrestling with its shadow. Only after this confrontation, after Gilgamesh acknowledges and embraces this wild aspect of himself through friendship with Enkidu, does he begin his journey toward true wisdom and wholeness. The Greeks, too, understood the shadow's power. In the myth of Perseus and Medusa, we find a profound allegory for shadow work. Medusa, the gorgon whose gaze turns men to stone, represents the petrifying effect of confronting what we most fear in ourselves. Perseus cannot look at her directly. To do so would mean death, psychological annihilation. Instead, he must use Athena's polished shield as a mirror, viewing the monster indirectly through reflection. This is precisely the method of shadow integration. We cannot stare directly into our darkness without being overwhelmed. We must approach it obliquely, through dreams, through the mirrors others provide, and through the careful work of analysis. Perseus does not destroy the shadow after severing Medusa's head. He carries it with him, using its power for his own purposes. The integrated shadow becomes a source of strength rather than a source of terror. In Norse mythology, Odin's quest for wisdom required him to sacrifice an eye at Mimir's well. This is no arbitrary price. To gain depth of vision, one must give up surface clarity. To see into the unconscious depths, into the shadow realm, requires surrendering the comfortable illusion of complete consciousness. Odin also hung himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 nights, a shamanic ordeal of self-sacrifice that granted him knowledge of the runes. This descent into suffering, this willing confrontation with death and darkness, mirrors the psychological death required for shadow integration. We must hang suspended between consciousness and unconsciousness, enduring the tension of opposites before wisdom emerges. The descent into the underworld appears across mythological traditions as a necessary stage of transformation. Inanna, the Sumerian goddess, must pass through 7 gates to reach the underworld, removing a piece of her regalia at each threshold until she stands naked and powerless before her dark sister Ereshkigal, who kills her and hangs her corpse on a hook. This stripping away of persona, this complete vulnerability before the shadow, leads to death and resurrection. Inanna does not return unchanged. She brings back knowledge from the depths, but she must also send a substitute to take her place in the underworld, The shadow cannot be eliminated. Something must remain in the darkness. Integration does not mean bringing everything into light, but learning to maintain a relationship with the depths. Persephone's abduction by Hades tells a similar story. Dragged into the underworld against her will, she initially resists her shadow encounter. Yet by eating the pomegranate seeds, she binds herself to the darkness, accepting that she must spend part of each year below. This seasonal movement between upper and lower worlds, between consciousness and unconsciousness, represents the ongoing nature of shadow work. We do not integrate once and finish. We must continually descend, continually return to the depths, and continually acknowledge our connection to darkness. Jung observed that modern civilization, with its emphasis on rationality and control, has created a massive collective shadow. We pride ourselves on being advanced, enlightened, and beyond the barbarism of our ancestors. Yet the 20th century witnessed horrors on a scale previously unimaginable: wars, genocides, systematic cruelty carried out with technological efficiency. This is the shadow writ large, the return of everything civilization has attempted to repress. On the individual level, this same dynamic plays out in countless ways. The politician who rails against moral corruption while engaging in the very behaviors he condemns. The religious leader who preaches humility while consumed by narcissistic pride. The activist who fights for justice while treating those closest to them with contempt. These are not mere hypocrites. They are people who have become identified with one aspect of themselves while remaining utterly unconscious of its opposite. The myth of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, though modern, captures this ancient truth. Jekyll's attempt to separate good from evil, to purify himself of darkness, leads not to sanctity but to monstrosity. The more he tries to eliminate Hyde, the more powerful Hyde becomes. This is the danger of shadow rejection. What we refuse to acknowledge does not disappear, but grows in the darkness, eventually overwhelming consciousness entirely. Jekyll's tragedy is that he never attempts integration, never seeks to understand Hyde as part of himself. He sees only enemy, only evil to be destroyed. His final fate is to be consumed by what he rejected. In the tale of Beauty and the Beast, we find a different approach. Belle must learn to see past the monstrous exterior, to recognize the prince within. But notice the structure of the story. The transformation happens not when Belle defeats the beast, but when she learns to love him. The shadow is not conquered but embraced. The monster reveals itself as the lost prince only when acknowledged, accepted, and integrated into the whole. This is the key to shadow work. We do not destroy what we fear in ourselves. We learn to relate to it with compassion, to recognize its pain, its needs, and its rightful place in our wholeness. The danger of projection cannot be overstated. When we see our own shadow qualities in others, we often react with disproportionate emotion. We are not merely annoyed or disappointed, we are outraged, disgusted, and filled with righteous fury. This intensity signals that something more than objective judgment is at work. We are encountering ourselves, though we do not recognize it. Jung called this phenomenon seeing the mote in thy brother's eye, but not the beam in thine own. It is far easier to condemn the faults of others than to acknowledge our own. Yet this outward focus leaves us powerless to change. We cannot control other people. We cannot force them to become what we think they should be. We can, however, take responsibility for our own darkness, our own capacity for error and harm. The myth of Narcissus offers a warning about the dangers of projection and the refusal to integrate the shadow. Narcissus falls in love with his own reflection, unable to recognize it as himself. He wastes away, consumed by desire for an image he cannot possess. This is the fate of those who project their inner gold onto others, who seek in external relationships what they refuse to develop within themselves. But there is another, deeper reading. Narcissus rejects Echo, the nymph who can only repeat his words. He rejects, in other words, the shadow that mirrors back his own nature. His punishment is to become trapped by his reflection, by the surface image of himself, never able to dive beneath to encounter the depths. Shadow work requires us to move past the reflection, past the carefully maintained image, into the dark waters beneath. The process of withdrawing projections is among the most difficult psychological work we can undertake. It requires us to ask, whenever we feel strong emotion toward another person, what in me does this person represent? What quality that I reject in myself am I seeing in them? This does not mean that others bear no responsibility for their actions, or that we should tolerate abuse or injustice. Rather, it means recognizing that our emotional reactions often tell us more about ourselves than about the other person. The biblical story of Jacob wrestling with the angel illuminates this struggle. In the darkness, Jacob encounters a mysterious figure and wrestles through the night. Neither can overcome the other. At dawn, the figure wounds Jacob but also blesses him, giving him a new name, Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. Jacob asks, "Tell me your name," but receives no answer. He names the place Peniel, the face of God, saying, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved." This nocturnal struggle represents the encounter with the shadow. We wrestle with something we cannot fully name, something that wounds us but also transforms us. The shadow will not surrender its mystery completely, but the struggle itself brings blessing. Jacob walks away, limping, marked permanently by his encounter. Shadow integration leaves us changed, sometimes wounded, but always more whole. Confession plays a crucial role in shadow integration. Not necessarily in the religious sense, though that too has its place, but in the psychological sense of honest self-disclosure. We must find someone, a therapist, a trusted friend, or a spiritual guide to whom we can reveal the parts of ourselves we normally hide. In the ancient mystery cults, initiates underwent rituals of confession and purification before being granted access to sacred knowledge. The Eleusinian mysteries, celebrated for nearly 2,000 years in ancient Greece, required participants to confess their sins before entering the temple. This was not mere religious formality, but psychological necessity. The mysteries promised transformation, a direct encounter with the divine, but such an encounter required first facing one's shadow. Jung wrote that every personal secret carries a sense of guilt, even when it is not morally wrong. Keeping secrets requires psychic energy and creates an internal division that manifests as tension and unease. When we confess, we release this burden, and we reconnect with our common humanity. For we discover that others, too, harbor similar darkness, that we are not uniquely flawed, but share in the universal human condition. The shadow must be carried consciously, Jung insisted, so it does not carry us. This means remaining aware of our capacity for evil, our potential for harm. Not dwelling on it obsessively, not using it as an excuse for poor behavior, but simply acknowledging its presence. Many spiritual traditions speak of the descent before the ascent, the dark night of the soul that precedes enlightenment. In alchemical symbolism, this is the nigredo, the blackening, the stage of decomposition and death that must occur before transformation becomes possible. The alchemists understood that the prima materia, the base material of transformation, must first be broken down completely, dissolved into chaos, before it can be reconstituted as gold. The psychological parallel is exact. Our carefully constructed ego identity must undergo dissolution and must face its own darkness and mortality before true transformation becomes possible. The shadow work represents this descent. We must venture into the underworld of our own psyche and confront what lurks there before we can emerge renewed. This is not a pleasant process. As we begin to recognize our shadow, we may experience shame, self-disgust, and despair. We may feel we are worse than we ever imagined, that the respectable persona we have constructed is nothing but a lie. These feelings, painful as they are, indicate that genuine work is taking place. The ancient initiates called this stage the katabasis, the descent, Orpheus descending to retrieve Eurydice, Aeneas visiting his father in Hades, Dante was guided through the circles of Inferno. Each hero must journey through darkness, witnessing horrors, and confronting what has been rejected before ascending to wisdom. The myth of Theseus in the labyrinth provides a map for this journey. The labyrinth, that twisting maze designed by Daedalus, represents the complexity of the unconscious. At its center dwells the Minotaur, half man, half bull, a creature born of unnatural union, hidden away in darkness because it is too monstrous to be acknowledged. This is the shadow personified. Theseus cannot avoid the encounter. He must venture into the labyrinth and must face the monster in its lair. But notice what makes his victory possible: Ariadne's thread. Without this connection to the surface, to consciousness, he would be lost in the maze forever. Shadow work requires this dual awareness. We must descend into unconsciousness, but we must maintain connection to consciousness, to the ego that can integrate what we discover. The thread represents this lifeline. We follow it down into darkness, and it guides us back to light. Yet Jung also warned against the opposite danger, identifying completely with the shadow, becoming cynical, and concluding that since we are flawed, morality itself is meaningless. This is the shadow's own form of inflation, just as dangerous as the inflation of believing ourselves to be purely good. True integration means holding both light and dark in consciousness, neither denying our capacity for evil nor surrendering to it. The goal is not perfection, but wholeness. We will never eliminate the shadow, never become purely virtuous beings free from all negative qualities. Such an achievement would not represent psychological health, but rather a different form of one-sidedness. The story of Lucifer's fall illuminates this danger. Lucifer, the light-bearer, the most beautiful of angels, falls through pride, through identifying himself as equal to God, rather than recognizing his created nature. But there is a psychological reading here as well. Lucifer represents consciousness severed from its source, ego divorced from self. He claims independent existence and refuses the humility of connection. His fall is the fall of all consciousness that forgets its roots in the unconscious, that sees itself as complete and self-sufficient. Shadow integration requires the opposite movement, not separation but reunion, not inflation but humble acknowledgement of our incompleteness. The Celtic myths speak of the Morrigan, the triple goddess who appears as maiden, mother, and crone, who presides over war and fate. She is both beautiful and terrible, creative and destructive, embodying the totality of existence. To encounter the Morrigan is to confront the shadow in its feminine form, not merely the rejected aggressive impulses, but the rejected wisdom of destruction, the knowledge that death is as necessary as birth, that dissolution makes way for new creation. Modern consciousness, particularly in its masculine forms, has difficulty with this truth. We want to build, to create, to ascend, but we fear destruction, ending, and descent. Yet wholeness requires both movements. Jung observed that the person who has integrated their shadow becomes more, not less, ethical. This seems paradoxical. How can acknowledging our capacity for evil make us more moral? The answer lies in consciousness. When we know our own darkness, we are less likely to be overwhelmed by it. We can recognize temptation when it arises and can make genuine choices rather than being driven by unconscious compulsions. The story of Persephone and the Grail illustrates this principle. Parsifal, the pure fool, initially fails in his quest because of his very purity, his unconsciousness. When he encounters the wounded Fisher King, he fails to ask the healing question because he has been taught not to be curious, not to question. His innocence is his flaw. Only after wandering for years, after encountering his shadow through various trials and temptations, does he return to the Grail Castle with the wisdom to ask the right question. His purity must be tempered with experience, his light with darkness, before he can serve as a healer. Moreover, shadow integration cultivates genuine compassion. When we have confronted our own capacity for failure and harm, we become less judgmental of others. We understand that people are not simply good or evil, but complex beings struggling with their own internal contradictions. The Buddhist concept of the Bodhisattva embodies this understanding. one who has glimpsed enlightenment but chooses to remain in the world of suffering to help others. The Bodhisattva's compassion arises not from naive innocence, but from having traversed the depths of existence, having confronted darkness both within and without, and choosing love anyway. The shadow also contains tremendous creative energy. Many of history's greatest artists, writers, and innovators drew upon their darkness as a source of inspiration. They did not deny their destructive impulses, but transformed them through creative expression. The rage becomes poetry, the despair becomes music, and the forbidden desire becomes art. This is sublimation in its truest sense, not repression, but transformation. In Greek mythology, Dionysus represents this creative chaos, this wild energy that must be integrated into Apollonian order. When the Thebans reject Dionysus, when King Pentheus tries to repress the Bacchic rites, the god's vengeance is terrible. Pentheus is torn apart by the Maenads, including his own mother, who in her frenzy mistakes him for a lion. This is what happens when the shadow is violently rejected. It returns with destructive force, destroying the very ego that sought to deny it. Jung himself experienced a profound encounter with his unconscious during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner turmoil following his break with Freud. He allowed himself to descend into the depths of his psyche, to engage with the strange and often terrifying images that arose. In his Red Book, Jung recorded the visions and dialogues that emerged during this period. He wrote of encountering various figures, wise old men, mysterious women, threatening demons, all representing different aspects of his own psyche. Through these encounters, he learned to relate to his unconscious not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a source of wisdom to be integrated. One of Jung's most significant encounters was with Philemon, a pagan wise man with the horns of a bull and the wings of a kingfisher. Philemon represented a perspective foreign to Jung's conscious mind, teaching him that thoughts are like animals in the forest, or people in a room, or birds in the air. They have independent existence. This was Jung's shadow wisdom speaking, the knowledge that the ego is not master in its own house, that consciousness is a small island in a vast ocean of unconsciousness. To accept Philemon was to accept limitation, to acknowledge forces beyond conscious control. The process Jung underwent was dangerous. He feared at times that he was losing his sanity, that the unconscious would overwhelm him entirely. Yet he persisted, trusting that if he could maintain consciousness throughout the descent, he would emerge transformed. His journey parallels that of Odysseus, who must visit the underworld to consult the shade of Tiresias before he can find his way home. Odysseus must dig a trench and fill it with blood to give the shades enough substance to speak. He must, in other words, give life to the dead, to what has been rejected and buried. He must feed his shadow with consciousness, with attention, before it can offer guidance. Shadow integration requires us to develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing tendencies in consciousness simultaneously, without being torn apart by them. This is not easy. Our minds naturally seek resolution and want to choose one side over the other. But true wholeness means learning to contain contradiction, to be patient with ambiguity, and to accept that we are not and will never be entirely consistent. The Taoist symbol of yin and yang expresses this principle visually. The dark contains a seed of light, the light contains a seed of darkness. They are not separate but interpenetrating, each giving rise to the other in eternal transformation. To be whole is to embody this dynamic balance, not static perfection. The Hindu concept of Shiva's dance captures this same truth. Shiva Nataraja dances the cosmos into being and out of being, creation and destruction unified in a single divine movement. One hand holds the drum of creation, another the flame of destruction. Beneath his foot lies the demon of ignorance, crushed not through rejection but through integration into the dance. The demon is not destroyed but subdued, its energy transformed into the very movement of existence. This is shadow work, not elimination but integration, not conquest but dance. We must also recognize that shadow integration is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process. New aspects of the shadow continually emerge as we grow and change. What we successfully integrated yesterday may need to be revisited tomorrow under different circumstances. This is why Jung spoke of individuation as a lifelong journey rather than a destination to be reached. The myths agree. Heracles completes 12 labors, but his life continues more trials, more challenges, more encounters with darkness. Each hero's journey is but one turn in a spiral that continues until death. The relationship between the ego and the shadow is ultimately one of cooperation rather than combat. The ego, our conscious sense of identity, need not see the shadow as an enemy. Rather, the shadow offers the ego energy, depth, and authenticity. When ego and shadow work together, when consciousness embraces rather than rejects the unconscious, we become capable of living with far greater intensity and purpose. In alchemical terms, this is the coniunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. The king and queen unite, sun and moon come together, and consciousness and unconsciousness join in creative union. From this marriage is born the divine child, the self, the totality that transcends yet includes both ego and shadow. Jung understood that this work cannot be accomplished in isolation. We need others to serve as mirrors, to reflect back to us what we cannot see ourselves. A skilled therapist, a wise friend, or even an honest enemy all can help us recognize our blind spots, the ways we deceive ourselves. In the Arthurian legends, the Round Table serves this function. Each knight is both individual and part of a collective, each reflecting aspects of the others. Lancelot's nobility and his betrayal, Gawain's courage and his rage, Percival's innocence and his ignorance. Together they form a mandala of human possibility, each completing what the others lack. Yet even with support, the work remains fundamentally solitary. No one can integrate our shadow for us. We must each venture into our own darkness, confront our own demons, and make our own peace with the parts of ourselves we have spent a lifetime rejecting. This requires courage of a particular kind, not the courage to face external threats, but the courage to face ourselves without flinching. The myth of Psyche illustrates this solitary journey. Psyche must complete 4 impossible tasks to win back Eros. The final task requires her to descend to the underworld and return with a box of Persephone's beauty. She is warned not to open the box, but curiosity, that most human of impulses, overcomes her. When she opens it, she falls into a death-like sleep. But this apparent failure is necessary. Only by succumbing to the underworld's power, by allowing herself to be overwhelmed, does she complete her transformation. Eros awakens her with a kiss, and she ascends to Olympus to become a goddess. Her mortality, her capacity for error, for failing, for giving in to temptation, is precisely what makes her divine. As we progress in this work, we may notice changes in our relationships. The people who once irritated us beyond measure may suddenly seem less bothersome. We recognize that what annoyed us in them was actually a quality we were projecting from our own unconscious. With this recognition, the emotional charge dissipates. We can see them more clearly and relate to them more authentically. This is the gift of withdrawn projection. We see the world as it is, rather than as a screen for our internal dramas. We may also find that certain relationships cannot survive our growth. Some connections are built on shared unconsciousness, on tacit agreements never to question, never to grow, and never to change. When one person begins the work of integration, these relationships become strained. This can be painful, but it is often necessary. We cannot remain unconscious to preserve relationships that depend on our unconsciousness. The myth of Orpheus offers a warning here. When he descends to retrieve Eurydice from death, he is told not to look back until they reach the surface. But at the last moment, doubt overtakes him. He turns to see if she is truly following, and she vanishes forever. Sometimes we must choose the familiar comfort of the past or the uncertain promise of transformation. We cannot have both. The shadow also appears in our relationship with the body. Many people reject their physical existence, seeing the body as somehow lower, less valuable than the mind or spirit. Yet the body, too, is part of our wholeness. Its needs, its pleasures, and its vulnerabilities all must be acknowledged and integrated. To reject the body is to create another form of shadow, one that will inevitably exact its revenge. The Christian Gnostics made this error, viewing matter as evil and the body as a prison from which the soul must escape. But Jung recognized that wholeness requires incarnation, requires bringing spirit into matter, consciousness into flesh. The mystery of the incarnation, God becoming human, represents precisely this union of opposites. The divine does not remain in transcendent purity, but descends into the mess and limitation of material existence. Jung observed that modern society's emphasis on rationality and control has created a particular kind of shadow crisis. We have become so identified with consciousness, so invested in the idea of ourselves as reasonable beings, that we have lost touch with the instinctual wisdom that animals possess naturally. This disconnection manifests as neurosis, as a sense that something vital is missing from our lives. The myth of Enkidu's civilization in the Epic of Gilgamesh captures this loss. When Enkidu is seduced by the temple prostitute, when he gains human consciousness, the animals flee from him. He has lost his instinctual innocence, yet this loss is necessary for his development. He cannot remain in the forest, but neither can he simply become civilized and forget his wild nature. His friendship with Gilgamesh represents the integration, the wild man, and the civilized king united, each tempering the other's extremes. Reconnecting with instinct does not mean abandoning consciousness and reverting to primitive behavior. Rather, it means allowing consciousness and instinct to inform each other, to work together rather than in opposition. The conscious mind provides direction, meaning, and purpose. The instinct provides energy, vitality, and authenticity. Together, they create a human being who is both aware and alive. The centaur of Greek mythology embodies this integration, half-human, half-horse consciousness, joined with animal nature. Chiron, the wise centaur, wounded by a poisoned arrow, becomes the wounded healer, teaching heroes while bearing his own incurable pain. His wisdom comes precisely from his hybrid nature, from his embodiment of the tension between rational and instinctual. The work of shadow integration ultimately serves something larger than personal happiness. Jung believed that each individual who undertakes this work contributes to the evolution of human consciousness itself. By making the unconscious conscious, by integrating what has been rejected, we participate in a collective healing. We become less likely to project our darkness onto others, and less likely to participate in the collective madness that leads to war, genocide, and systemic oppression. The Hindu concept of Loka Sangraha captures this, the welfare of the world. Our individual work serves the collective. When Krishna instructs Arjuna on the battlefield, he tells him that even though the enlightened one sees beyond all dualities, beyond good and evil, he must still act righteously for the sake of the world. People follow the example of the great. Shadow work, then, is not self-indulgent navel-gazing, but world service. This does not mean we will create a perfect world. Human beings will always struggle with darkness and will always face the tension between good and evil. But if enough people undertake the work of integration, if enough individuals take responsibility for their own shadows, we might create a world slightly less dominated by unconscious destructiveness, slightly more capable of conscious choice. The Buddhist concept of the Pure Land offers hope here, not a paradise in some distant future or afterlife, but a realm of consciousness that arises when beings commit to awakening. Each person who integrates their shadow contributes to this collective transformation. The paradox at the heart of shadow work is this: by accepting our darkness, we become more truly human. By acknowledging our capacity for evil, we become more genuinely good. By embracing our wholeness, light and dark together, we participate more fully in life itself. The alchemical gold is not found by rejecting the base material, but by transforming it. Lead becomes gold not by being discarded, but by being subjected to the alchemical process. Our shadow material, our rejected qualities, and our darkest aspects, these are the prima materia of transformation. Jung's final wisdom on this matter was simple but profound. We must learn to love our shadow as we love our neighbor, for the shadow is our neighbor, the one who lives closest to us, who accompanies us through every moment of our existence. To reject the shadow is to reject ourselves, to live in a state of inner civil war that can never be won. To embrace the shadow is to come home to ourselves, to accept the fullness of who we are. In the parable of the prodigal son, the father welcomes back the wayward child with celebration. The shadow is this prodigal aspect of ourselves, wandering far from home, spending its inheritance on riotous living. When it returns, we must meet it not with judgment, but with embrace, with the joy of reunion, recognizing that our household is complete only when all members are present. The journey of integration is not easy. It requires us to confront what we most fear in ourselves, to acknowledge what we have spent our lives denying. Yet this very difficulty is what makes the work valuable. Easy achievements change nothing. Only by undertaking what seems impossible do we discover capabilities we never knew we possessed. The hero's journey always includes the ordeal, the supreme test that seems beyond the hero's capacity. Theseus facing the Minotaur, Psyche sorting the seeds, Heracles cleaning the Augean stables. These impossible tasks become possible only when the hero ceases relying solely on ego strength and opens to help from unexpected sources, from the unconscious, from the gods, and from the rejected aspects of self. In the end, shadow integration is not about becoming someone different. It is about becoming more fully who we already are. The person we will be after this work is not a stranger, but our truest self, freed from the constraints of repression and projection. This is what the myths have always taught. The treasure hard to attain, the golden fleece, the holy grail, the philosopher's stone, these are symbols of the self, the totality we become when we integrate all aspects of our being. And where do we find these treasures? Not in some distant land, but right here, within ourselves, guarded by the very dragons we most fear. The shadow waits for us still, in the darkness where we have banished it. It waits with patience born of eternity, knowing that eventually we must return, for we cannot run forever from ourselves. Sooner or later, every one of us must turn and face what we have refused to see. And in that moment of recognition, in that meeting with our own darkness, the possibility of true transformation arises. Like Dante meeting Virgil at the gates of hell, we find a guide in our descent. The shadow itself, once acknowledged, becomes the psychopomp, the guide who leads us through the underworld of our own psyche. The myths end where they began, with the hero returning home transformed. Odysseus reaches Ithaca, Persephone rises in spring, the prodigal son reunites with his father. But the return is never to the same place. We cannot go back to innocence once we have eaten the fruit of knowledge. We can only go forward into a new kind of wholeness, one that includes both light and dark, both conscious and unconscious, and both divine and human. This is the promise of shadow integration, not perfection, not the elimination of struggle, but wholeness. The authentic, integrated life that comes from knowing and accepting ourselves completely in all our terrible, beautiful complexity.